Other results, to summarize what the situation was at the beginning of independence, and Aldous has mentioned a few of these terms already. So, well, again, replacement of Estonian with Russian in most public spheres, especially in the north. Privileged status of Russian, not just in Estonia, but everywhere else in the Soviet Union. Russian for, again, those particular public spheres. As Aldous has mentioned, this is very important that other non-Estonians, such as Ukrainians and Belarusians, were schooled in Russian, and so they became the so-called Russian-speaking community in the country. So there was a full set of social institutions provided in Russian and a pastoral set in Estonian. So you only had one option or the other when you're going to school, but when it comes to a lot of these other things, the military and so on, they only existed in Russian. Asymmetric bilingualism, as Aldous mentioned, and also these issues of minorized majority and so on. So, and what's important here, and it's in discussion I was having with one of my supervisors in Australia about asymmetric bilingualism, and he said to me, well, all bilingualism is asymmetric. Name a case where, where there's an equal relationship. Probably true, but the point is here is that Estonian is the local language, and it was in the lower position, which is an unusual situation, and that's why it's important to point it out. As Aldous has mentioned as well, this issue of the minority complex, it's actually a term I borrowed from Ina Druvieta when she was talking about Latvia, but I use it here for Estonia as well, that this high level of tolerance in switching to the language of the other person. So, of course, it's mostly we're talking about Russian, but it's also with Finnish people, because one of the biggest industries in Estonia is tourism, and over half of the tourists are from Finland. And especially people of the older generation don't speak any other language except for Finnish. So they don't have any other option of what they're going to speak to Estonians in, but of course we can also imagine a situation where they would somehow try and understand each other speaking their own languages. But we don't have that situation because, one, because Estonians are used to switching to the language of the other people, and two, because the Finnish people are used to getting service in Finnish. Nowadays, of course, you get English between the two groups as well, but it has traditionally always been Finnish. And in the northern part of Estonia, you could watch Finnish television during Soviet times. So a lot of people in the northern part of the country could at least understand the language. The Soviets tried to block those television signals, but they couldn't do it without also affecting the television reception in Finland, so they had to stop doing it. And the other side to this, of course, is that we have Estonians in their tolerance of other people's language and switching to the language of the other people, but on the other side we have the Russian speakers who became used to the idea that they could speak Russian anyway, at least in the former Soviet Union. So I'll just show a couple more slides from this second part of the... How much time do I have? 10 minutes? Okay, so I'll talk a little bit about the current and future perspectives, and then I'll save the rest for tomorrow. So where are we now with the domains of usage and what is policy doing? All this, again, has already mentioned a lot of these, but Estonian is the only state language, and as part of that, in order to become a citizen of the country, you need to be able to speak the language. As Aldous already mentioned, that also means for people who arrived during the Soviet period that they have to go through the naturalization process to become a citizen. So it's one of the major tools for encouraging people to learn the language. As it's also the only official language, it means that all institutions, state institutions, officially at least, only run in Estonian, except, and this is something I'm pretty sure it's not the case in Latvia, well, because of the demographic situation, and I'll talk about that. Yeah, that in the northeast, the local governments can run their internal affairs in Russian or German or whatever the case would be, but of course it's Russian. But any external communication with the central authorities in Tallinn has to then be in Estonian. But of course they run their own internal affairs in Russian. Interpreters are provided in court. Now, even though we have these particular laws and the way things are supposed to run in theory, it's not always the case in practice. For example, I don't know how many times I've been in a tram and then there's been some problem and the tram driver comes out and says something in Russian. And they're a public official. They should be speaking Estonian, according to the law at least. The correction system runs also primarily in Russian. And also not just tram drivers. I recently went on with a group of researchers to the public hospital in Narva, and I'll talk more about this tomorrow because it's to do with the plan for the development of the Estonian language, the official government plan for the next few years. And the reason we were there was to interview and I can only think of the word in Estonian, to give questionnaires to staff in the hospital to find out what their needs were for the Estonian language and to learn more Estonian. Now, as their doctors, you would assume that they could speak Estonian, but the majority of these doctors couldn't. It's come about because if you are from that city in the northeast, from Narva, and you go and study in an Estonian, or in Tartu would be the place you go to study to become a doctor, and then you would learn to speak Estonian in the process, or at least improve your Estonian, it's very unlikely that you would then go back to Narva. So most of the doctors there are from Belarus or from the Ukraine, and even though it's the law that they, as doctors, have to have the highest level of Estonian capacity, it's somehow they work around it by saying, oh yes, they will learn it at some point, but they just haven't. And there are people from the language inspectorate that go there to check on these things, but what are they going to do? And the point is, and I'll look at it more later, but the point is in that part of the country, it's 95% Russian speaking. They don't use the Estonian language. When we gave them these questionnaires, it said, what percentage of the time do you use a language other than Russian? Or wasn't exactly the question, but and the answer was Russian is 99% of the time, and maybe once a month or something you get someone who speaks Estonian. So this is the point. They just don't have Estonian speakers in that part of the country. And this is the unique problem that Estonia has. Latvia has its own set of problems because the population is spread separately, but our specific problem is that part of the country. The other things, so education, Russian is still provided as it was during the Soviet times in primary and secondary schools. That should say changing. In secondary schools it's changing, and something I'll talk about later. Universities are Estonian only. Courses are provided for, if you're Russian speaking, you went to a Russian speaking school, you do get to do an Estonian course. Normally it's specific for your discipline. So if you're studying to be a doctor, your first semester is learning medical Estonian. Now the service sector should, in theory, and mostly in practice, in Tallinn, for example, you in shops will always be able to get service in Estonian. But again, in Narva, it's very, very difficult to find service there in Estonian. Industry, as in blue-collar type workers, is often in Russian. Agriculture, being from parts of the country where there are essentially very few Russian speakers, runs in Estonian. I think I'll just then quickly show you a little couple of more slides about what the current situation is, and then I'll leave it for today. So here you can see the breakdown. It's not just Russians, ethnic Russians that make up the non-Estonians. There are Ukrainians, Belarusians, and others, but majority is Russian. Now, just over half of those are not citizens of Estonia. It doesn't mean that they're all non-citizens. About half of that half, so that's a quarter, are citizens of Russia, and then the other are stateless, meaning not having a passport of any country. They get an Estonian passport, but they're not a citizen, and they can now travel with that within the European Union. And here, which is what I said that I was going to show you, is the regional distribution. So now this is a specific term from the Estonian Statistical Office, so I've given you a definition of it here. An immigrant here doesn't just refer to non-ethnic Estonian people, it specifically refers to people who are not born in Estonia or those with one parent who was not born in Estonia. So it's not all of the non-ethnic Estonians. But of course the distribution is very similar. And as I mentioned, it's different to in Latvia, where in Latvia you have, I think it's all top 8 largest cities have almost half a Russian-speaking population. In Estonia we have about 35%, I think it is in Tallinn, which is Russian-speaking. It's quite significant, but it's less than half. But then over here in the northeast corner, the Ida-Virumaa region, or East Virumaa region, it's almost, well, it essentially is a Russian-speaking area. But I think then, oh, okay, I'll just show this one more. This shows the percentage of the people in each of those regions that can speak Estonian. So in most areas you can see throughout the center of the country there, it's the darkest color, which means 90 to 100% of immigrants in those areas can speak Estonian. It's very high. The islands and then the southeast, for some reason, they were not able to put together statistics. I'm not sure why, but those are also quite homogeneously Estonian speaking, or at least if there are Russian speakers there, they would all speak Estonian. So the two main areas are Ida-Virumaa, which is in, as you can see, in the lightest color. So it means that throughout that whole region, only 38% of the Russian-speaking people living there can speak Estonian. In the city of Narva, again, the main city there, it's about 15%, I think. And I even wonder whether that's true, as I say, with my experiences of having been there. And then in Harju, which is the top county there where Tallinn is, the percentage is 69. So, but I think I'll leave it there, and then the rest I'll talk about tomorrow.